Now, look, we just heard from the president, and while he laid out his view of the war in Iran, there was one thing he didn't address tonight, at least directly: NATO. Okay, I was just talking about it, but just days ago, the president said he was absolutely considering pulling the United States out of the alliance. So even if he didn't say it, the question is still very real. Could the United States actually leave NATO? And if it did, what would that look like? What would that mean? The thing is, as I mentioned, it's a treaty. The U.S. has been a founding member since 1949, 32-country alliance. It's built on that idea of collective defense. Is walking away that simple? Is it like we're out? Well, look, for starters, Congress would have to approve it. There's a law passed in 2023 that requires the president to get 2/3 of the Senate or an act of Congress to withdraw from NATO, meaning this is not a solo decision. Now, could a president try to go around that? Sure. But it would probably trigger a major court battle over whether the executive branch could exit a treaty on its own. And even if that somehow holds up and the U.S. decides to leave, it wouldn't happen overnight. NATO requires a 1-year notice period before any withdrawal takes effect. But here's where things get kind of interesting. A president doesn't even actually have to leave NATO to undercut it. You see, a president could pull tens of thousands of troops out of Europe, scale back military support, or simply signal that the U.S. might not fully back its allies. And suddenly, this alliance still exists on paper, but in practice, it starts to look very, very different, right? But is this even likely to happen? Are we talking about a clean break or kind of a slow drift? For that, I go to my panel. Hal Kempfer, retired Marine intelligence officer with 24 years of experience and service. David Tafuri, a specialist in public international law and a partner at Arnon Fox Schiff. Good to see you both. Hal, I'm going to start with you. I can't talk about NATO first. We just had the president talking about a major military operation in Iran, what we can expect. You know, the president described swift, decisive, overwhelming victories. I talked about it before. I think the biggest takeaway is basically saying Iran is no longer the threat that they once were. Your perspective from what you heard and your perspective on what could happen if Iran does not come to the table like the president wants.
Well, what I see is that basically what the president outlined is why we are here, what we're doing. And the thing I really listened for was he says 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, that's responding to domestic political pressure. He has to do that. Every president has to do that. But what he did talk about was using essentially overwhelming force in that period of time. You know, he laid out, the Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, massive destruction with everything else. But he did also say, that basically would take out the power plants, which would turn off the lights over there, amongst a lot of other things. But the thing I thought was interesting was he kind of alluded to NATO when he talked about the strait naturally opening up. And I go, naturally opening up. That's another way of saying our allies come in and do it. And in his case, the allies come in because the U.S. leaves.
So that's the number one question I have for you. Do we need NATO or do they need us, right? So if you take the president's speech at face value, the United States and Israel were able to carry out this entire war and essentially defeat Iran, according to the president. You tell me, if we're having this conversation about whether or not we're going to pull out, and I'll talk to David about the legality of it, do we need NATO or do they need us?
I think it's both. I've worked a lot with NATO. I've worked with our NATO allies over in the Middle East multiple times. I've worked with them in Europe, obviously, because that's where we kind of do most of our NATO stuff. But I think we need NATO. I think we need NATO for global geostrategic reasons. We need NATO. If we get in a big war with China, I would definitely want to have NATO as something that we can look upon as possibly bringing in allies. NATO does a lot of good for us. And actually, pulling our forces out, there isn't any real cost savings of pulling our forces out of Europe. So I would say they need to do a little accounting on that as well. We've been there a long time. It's actually fairly cost effective to keep our forces in Europe. So there's a lot of good that comes from NATO.
David, it's legal time, okay? You and I both know that anything can look pretty black and white, the letter of the law. It never is. I'm going to talk about birthright citizenship in a little bit. Okay, if the president, and I laid it out, if the president tries to go around that congressional requirement, seems, again, pretty, black letter law, what does the legal fight look like? Who would win? I was trying to think, what would the president's argument be? Would it be the Constitution? Okay, the Constitution is silent on withdrawing from treaties. But again, we have that law from a few years ago, so talk to me about it.
Thanks for having this conversation because I think it's an important one. As you noted, there was a law passed at the end of 2023 that prevents any president from withdrawing from NATO unless Congress approves or the Senate approves by a supermajority, 2/3. Now, if the president were to do so anyway without that congressional approval, he would likely do it on the justification that he is commander-in-chief and that as the executive, he's in charge of foreign policy, and he has decided that foreign policy requires us and our national security interests to withdraw from NATO. Now, the Congress could challenge that. And the arbiter would, of course, be the U.S. Supreme Court. So Congress would have to bring an action against the president in the Supreme that would get to the Supreme Court. And now it's a Republican-controlled Congress. I'm not sure Congress could actually do that. Also, any other aggrieved party, for instance, a contractor that receives money from the NATO alliance and serves the NATO alliance might be aggrieved and injured, and they could perhaps bring a case as well. But ultimately, it would be up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But I also happen to agree with what you said at the outset, which is even if the president cannot legally withdraw, he can do things to essentially negate the U.S. NATO U.S. cooperation with NATO and to sort of decapitate our involvement in NATO and cause our cooperation to lessen.
He is not happy with the allies after not getting the support that he wanted through the Strait of Hormuz. Hal, go to you. Is NATO really a deterrent, or is it a paper tiger, right? Are foreign bad actors actually fearful of NATO? I recall the president even saying that Russia believed that it was more of a paper tiger. You tell me.
No, Russia doesn't think it's a paper tiger. I'll tell you, Putin's big focus is to break up NATO, to end NATO. Why? Because NATO stops Russia. Russia's geographical ambitions stop. Same with the USSR. They stop because of NATO. It's right there. And NATO's bigger than it ever was. With Sweden and Finland joining, it's much bigger and it's getting stronger. Now, one thing I would point out, though, and it is a good point. You remember Charles de Gaulle in the 60s, he had a very hyper-French nationalist sort of view. And so what he did was he disengaged France. France was a member of NATO, but they didn't participate in joint exercises. They didn't host the headquarters. One time NATO headquarters was in Paris. All of that changed under Charles de Gaulle. Something like that with the U.S. We could reallocate forces. We can just not fill billets at NATO headquarters. There's a lot of things we can do.
David, real quick, any upside if we pull out of NATO? I mean, supporters say allies are not spending enough. The U.S. is carrying too much of the burden. Any upside?
Well, first of all, there's one thing important to note, which is at the end of last year, Congress passed a law that said the U.S. cannot draw down the number of forces in Europe for a period of longer than 45 days. So that actually would potentially restrict the president on pulling troops out of our NATO bases. But I don't see any upside. I really don't. I think the U.S. is going to still spend a lot on our defense budget. President Trump is increasing the defense budget, not because of NATO, but because he has other priorities that he wants to fulfill. Our defense budget goes to our own defense. Yes, it also helps NATO, but we're not going to decrease that if we're not part of NATO. Arguably, we'd have to increase it because we can't rely on our allies.
Have I mentioned how much I enjoy having both of you guys on? Really explained it so easily for our audience. Hal Kempfer, David Teferi, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you both.
Thanks, Jesse.
You.
You got it.